Matt Frei, you're our presenter who's been in New York this week covering Donald Trump appearing in court, an unprecedented moment. What are you going to tell me?
We're talking about the criminal charges leveled against former President Donald Trump here in New York earlier this week. Historic, because this has never happened before. But the question is whether Donald Trump will make a new kind of history, which is if he gets found guilty on these charges and indeed all the other cases potentially coming down the pipe for him, could he still be elected President of the United States? It's possible.
So Matt Frei, you have been in downtown Manhattan for a number of days for this historic moment, the first former president of the United States to be charged for a crime. Before we get into the details, I guess I just want to ask you, what's it been like there for the last few days covering this event?
Well, feverish, I think, is the best way to describe it. So just around the corner from where I'm standing now is the court building where he was handed his indictments. He had his fingerprints taken. I think he entered the building, through a side entrance, kind of underground with his motorcade from Trump Tower, which is, about half an hour up the road from here on the other side of Manhattan. In front of the courthouse, you had, hundreds of police officers, NYPD, lots of protesters, both against Trump and for Trump. And then, of course, everyone outnumbered by the world's media, including us. And it was it was a circus. It's what you expect when Trump gets involved in anything at all. And of course, it raises a bit of a dilemma because, we're giving Donald Trump all this oxygen once again through the media, through the coverage, which is exactly what he craves, because the one thing that he fears more than anything else is to be ignored. And arguably, he had been ignored for many months, especially after his relative debacle in the midterm elections in November, when his candidates, the ones that he supported, did not do nearly as well as he thought they would. And he still declared his candidacy for the presidency. And everything went kind of, off Broadway, to coin a phrase. People weren't that interested. And now these indictments have put him back in the headlines. He's all over the newspapers. He's all over cable television here in America and indeed around the world. So we've all done him a bit of a favor. However, at the same time, if you look at his face from the stills photographs that were released from the court earlier this week, staring into the middle distance of an uncertain legal future, he can't have been that happy. Donald Trump is not used to sitting in court in dock. There was one tiny little moment that spoke volumes, where a bit of moving footage of him coming out of the doors of the court building to go down another corridor with the camera fixed on him. And no one opened the door for Donald Trump. He had to open his own door, and he's not used to that.
Matt, you talk about, the media giving this so much oxygen, and, it is a historic event, a former president being, criminally charged. But, in terms of those moments where, he came through the door and no one held it for him, the idea of him being in court, having to be silent, only being able to say not guilty, having a judge look down on him. A lot of the media has been sort of trying to interpret Donald Trump's body language. Do you think they're over-interpreting it? Or do you think that actually, given this is a first for Donald Trump, it has in some ways changed him?
I'm imagining, and this is what, people who know him much better than I do have told us in the last few days, I'm imagining that he felt both vexed that this was happening to him at all. It's a bit of a humiliation. He felt delighted that he was back in the headlines, and in his own cunning political way was able to weaponize the charges against him for political and campaign purposes. He's raised $7 million since the indictments were announced. That's a lot of money, even for him. And at the same time, he must have been a little bit scared that with all the other cases coming down the pipe, he might actually end up, if he's unlucky, he might end up behind bars. And that's not a great place for Donald Trump. He's used to living, in a penthouse apartment or in a massive estate in Florida. Not a great place for him to be.
Donald J. Trump was charged with 34 felony counts. He's accused of falsifying business records, that he concealed the fact that he was paying hush money to stop news stories getting out about his private life. The 34 counts relate to the $130,000 paid by his personal lawyer, Michael Cohen, to the adult film star Stormy Daniels just before the 2016 election. She alleged she had an affair with Trump, something he denies. Prosecutors claim there was an Oval Office meeting between Trump and Cohen in 2017 where this arrangement was secured. But falsifying business records isn't a felony on its own. unless it's proven that in doing so, Donald Trump was trying to commit or conceal a second crime. We're still unsure what those alleged second crimes are, but in his press conference after Trump's court appearance, the Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg mentioned New York State election laws that make it a crime to promote a candidate by unlawful means, and that the Stormy Daniels payment would have exceeded the federal cap on campaign contributions. And Bragg said there were other hush money payments that prove a wider pattern to Trump's behaviour to influence that presidential election. That he paid, via the magazine The Inquirer, another woman who alleged an affair, which Donald Trump denied, as well as a doorman who claimed to have a scandalous story about Trump that proved to not be true. Donald Trump pleaded not guilty to the 34 felony charges, and the issue raised by Trump's lawyers and supporters is whether the alleged falsifying of business records did indeed conceal a second crime, and whether a candidate for federal office, like Trump was at the time, can be prosecuted under state election laws, as is argued by Bragg. Donald Trump is not due back in court until December. What's been the reaction, though, to the 34 felony charges that were announced? Because some individuals who aren't even Donald Trump fans, legal experts, are sort of questioning the strength of this case.
Well, there's the political reaction and there's the legal reaction. Let's talk about the legal reaction first. A lot of attorneys in this city who know a lot about white-collar crime, which is what the district attorney is a classic example of, even though they don't like Trump, and even though they really want to see him serve time, they're not entirely happy with this case because they think that it's based on a legal presumption that may be difficult to prove in a court of law. So falsifying business documents, which is a very common crime, or I should say misdemeanor, sometimes a crime, in the city that also has Wall Street around the corner from us, financial capital of the world. This is the bread and butter of the district attorney's office. So falsifying business documents, that's serious business, and he's accused of doing that 34 different times. But it's a misdemeanor under New York state law. It becomes a crime punishable by 4 years in jail for each count, if proven guilty. It becomes a crime if that falsification of business documents is seen to cover up a federal crime. And the federal crime, in the sense that they're trying to prove here, is that by falsifying these documents, by paying hush money to Stormy Daniels, the former adult film star, he was trying to circumvent election law, in the middle of a federal presidential election. So the defense, we imagine, might say, well, hang on a minute, he did that, he paid that money, or he got his lawyer to pay the money, and then falsified the documents around it, because he didn't want his family to suffer the shame of public humiliation because, Donald Trump, the father, and the husband had an affair with a former porn star. That's completely understandable, and that in itself is not a crime. So the DA has to prove that that's the federal crime that was committed, circumventing national election law, if you like, with the payment of this money. So that's one problem legally. The second problem is that the two star witnesses in this, Stormy Daniels, a former adult film star, and Michael Cohen, his former lawyer, who's already served time for this, they can be presented by the defense as unreliable witnesses. So even those lawyers who are desperate to see Donald Trump serve time are saying this is a really bad case on which to start all the other crimes that he might potentially face, insurrection, or rather egging on insurrection January the 6th, the trying to steal votes in Georgia, all that stuff. Because if he gets off on this one, then people might not believe any of the other stuff that's coming down. And you asked me a question, but the political dimension of this is also very important, of course.
Alvin Bragg, the district attorney, is also someone who must be aware of the political ramifications and the idea that this is a political persecution. He's a man who wants to uphold the rule of law, and he wouldn't take this to court, one assumes, unless he thinks he has a really watertight case, especially if he knows that, the idea that if Donald Trump was found not guilty, those ramifications would be pretty, who knows what would happen. So one would feel that Alvin Bragg, even if he hasn't divulged everything, he must understand that, if I'm going to take this to court against Donald Trump, I'm going to have something quite strong.
I think even those, the lawyers, attorneys, members of the judicial community that are desperate to see Trump behind bars are wondering whether Alvin Bragg has made a strong enough case with which to go forward. Remember, this was called the zombie case. So, Bragg's predecessor looked at it and didn't want to touch it, didn't want to take it further. Federal judges looked at it and didn't want to take it further. So what has he found that allowed Alvin Bragg to say, this is something worth pursuing? And in the legal documents released yesterday, to be honest, those who know much more about the law than I do would say, well, actually, we haven't really discovered something that is a massive smoking gun, the dynamite that will actually do for Trump. So there are enough questions here, I think, and the danger politically is that this thing either drags on and could possibly even be downgraded from a crime to a misdemeanor charge, in which case, he's very unlikely to serve any time for it. And it just gives him the excuse to say, look, they're going after me, it's a witch hunt. And even though the other cases that also potentially await Trump on, charges of sedition, egging on, the mob on January the 6th on Capitol Hill, trying to steal the election from Joe Biden, all that stuff, which is much more serious, which many of his detractors wanted to see coming into the courts first before this thing. It's possible that if he's either let off on these charges here in New York, or if they're going to get kicked into the long grass and diluted, then people might say, well, hang on, that wasn't really a case against him, nor is this other stuff.
There are those other cases, those other investigations. There is the special counsel, Jack Smith, who is looking into two issues. One, as you say, is the insurrection on January the 6th and whether Donald Trump incited that riot, whether he, had a hand in trying to stop the peaceful transfer of power. And that special counsel is also looking into those government documents that were found by the FBI last summer. Firstly, again, the government documents issue, Joe Biden himself, documents were found in his office. When it comes to that particular issue, is that another one which Donald Trump again can weaponize? Because just as much as a Trump supporter can say, well, who cares about him paying some money to Stormy Daniels, they might say, well, he left some documents there. Is that really an issue you want to get him on?
Indeed. I think that they're already saying that. I think, again, I'm talking slightly out of school here because I'm not a lawyer, but I imagine that a lot of the documents case will come down to what was in the documents that Trump had compared to the documents that Joe Biden had. Trump's documents, of which there were boxes and boxes, contained, sensitive military and intelligence information. They should not have ended up in Mar-a-Lago. The second question is, how reluctant was he to give up those boxes? At first they had to be discovered. The FBI had to look for them. He gave some of them up, but didn't give all of them up. And then the FBI had to, turn up at Mar-a-Lago, in their dozens to get the rest of them. That doesn't look particularly good. But again, you could pick holes into that argument if you were a Trump defense lawyer. In a way, the case that's perhaps the most serious that you haven't mentioned yet is the one in Fulton County in Georgia, where in Georgia, famously, Trump rang up one of the senior election officials and said, find me an extra, 12,000 votes so I can, get Georgia over the line. And Georgia, a swing state, then becomes mine. And that could, didn't, but it could, in his mind at the time, have swung the presidency in his favor. Again, how serious was that conversation? Was that done under duress? Did he threaten the election officials in Georgia with that? That case, there is a deadline at the end of April, which means that the district attorney in Fulton County has to file, she has to file charges by then. In a sense, that could be the most serious one. And certainly Trump's opponents are looking to all these other cases, saying this is the stuff that really matters, because what the danger of Trump is not just that he's, corrupt and, in their eyes morally repugnant, is that he tried to subvert American democracy, and that is, that has to be punished.
And I guess all of those cases all have a similar thread, which I guess is also what Alvin Bragg was talking about, which is Trump concealing the truth, concealing whether he had documents, concealing that he knew what was going on January the 6th and he had the power to stop it, concealing the fact that he was, making those phone calls to the Georgia Secretary of State. I guess it all fits a sort of pattern of a man who lies, but also a man who has sort of, one would argue, brought, shame on the presidency.
Or put it this way, Donald Trump is a business tycoon from the world of real estate, the world of cement, born in this city. And the way you do business here, and the way he did business here, was always with these, backhanded favors. That's the way he operated with impunity for decades, and that's the way he would argue lots of people operate successfully in this city and make a ton of money. You can take the man out of Manhattan real estate, but you can't take Manhattan real estate out of the man. Now, this man ends up in the White House where a totally different set of rules apply. So that sort of, inattention to the facts, to the details, to the truth, that, economical attitude towards the truth, to coin a phrase, is something that he took to Washington with him, thinking that if this has got me into the White House, well, I can just carry on regardless. It's around this idea that ultimately, he developed an anger and a vengefulness when people didn't take him seriously or didn't believe his version. That's the way.
As Trump's hearing drew to a close, the judge, Juan Merchan, warned Trump to please refrain from making statements that are likely to incite violence or civil unrest or jeopardize the safety or well-being of any individuals. However, once he arrived back at his Mar-a-Lago home in Palm Beach, Florida, the former president made a primetime address to his supporters in which he said America is now a failing nation and claimed he's the victim of election interference and that this is a fake case.
Incredibly, we are now a failing nation. We are a nation in decline. And now these radical left lunatics want to interfere with our elections by using law enforcement. We can't let that happen. This fake case was brought only to interfere with the upcoming 2024 election, and it should be dropped immediately.
He also lashed out at the Manhattan District Attorney, Alvin Bragg, and the judge, Juan Merchan, and the prosecutors in charge of other cases against him.
And this is where we are right now. I have a Trump-hating judge with a Trump-hating wife and family whose daughter worked for Kamala Harris and now receives money from the Biden-Harris campaign, and a lot of it.
And this is how he finished that defiant speech.
With all of this being said, and with a very dark cloud over our beloved country, I have no doubt, nevertheless, that we will make America great again.
If you look at the press conference that he gave at Mar-a-Lago after the indictments, of course he got back on his plane, he flew back to Florida, his safe space, and he gave this blistering press conference in the ballroom at Mar-a-Lago. But what it shows you is that even if Donald Trump gets off on the charges that were filed here, he remains his own worst enemy. Right? The reason why Donald Trump is not president today is because he behaves like Donald Trump.
Matt, let's talk about the politics then. We've gone through the legals. Let's talk about the politics. As you've said, Donald Trump has, according to his aides, raised more than $7 million for his re-election campaign. It's evident that this is clearly helping his base, which we know loves him. But I wanted to ask you, Matt, about even those who question Donald Trump have also come out to defend him. Ron DeSantis, he hasn't announced that he's going to run, but he's seen as Trump's biggest rival, the governor of Florida. He's denounced this case in New York. Even Mike Pence, his former vice president, who has been critical of Trump, especially over January 6th, he's come out against this case, as has Mitt Romney, one of the more sort of centrist Republicans who ran for president in 2012, now the senator in Utah. What's going on there, Matt? Why are these people falling into line under Donald Trump when previously they would have actually criticized him?
I would be careful with the phrase falling into line. I would say the people that you describe there fall into two camps. There are those people who might still want to run for office, like Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, or indeed Mike Pence, who might also run for the White House, who do not want to alienate Trump's base. Because even though they can't stand Trump, I mean, they loathe the guy, and they don't particularly like his base either. They need those votes, because that base, even though it's not enough to win you the general election, it is certainly enough to get you the nomination. So you've got to keep them sweet somehow. And it's a really tricky thing for them to do, to both be critical of Donald Trump and not upset the millions of voters who are still loyal to him. The other group, and you mentioned Mitt Romney there, another one is John Bolton, the former national security advisor to Trump, former ambassador under George Bush to the United Nations. They are upset with these charges because they don't think that they're serious enough to finally land him in jail, right? And that is, that's their particular beef here. In other words, you're giving him, as I said before, all the oxygen that he needs in order to carry on his campaign, to be relevant again, but you're not doing enough to actually make him face justice.
Isn't the bigger point, though, Matt, that this is the Republican Party in a bind, isn't it? Because it's one thing to win a primary for the Republican nomination where everyone loves Trump, but when it comes to the wider electorate, as we saw in 2020, as we saw at the midterms, there are those who have been turned off Trump even if they voted for him before. Do we know what those swing voters or independent voters are thinking about this? Does this make them think, maybe I should go back to Trump because the system's rigged, or is this just another thing against him?
It's really hard to answer that at the moment because, first of all, there's, I can imagine some swing voters might say, well, this smells a little bit like a witch hunt. Even if anti-Trump lawyers are saying that it's political more than judicial, then some swing voters are going to feel the same way, although we don't have those numbers yet. Then there are those people, and remember, every election is a comparison between one candidate and another. There are those people who will say, the people who will vote for Biden if he runs again, we assume that he will say this is fine. And then there are those people who might say, well, actually, although I don't like Trump, at least he seems a bit more robust physically than Biden does. And in a sense, what you have, and this is the extraordinary reality of American politics today, you've got one party, the Republican Party, that is held hostage to Donald Trump, and you've got another party, the Democrat Party, which is held hostage to the cardiovascular system of an 18-year-old man who's going to be 82 by the time we get to the election. And whatever you say about Biden, he doesn't look particularly well. And if he were to keel over before the election, who are they going to put there in his place? Kamala Harris, the vice president, does not poll well. No one thinks, even her best friends don't think she can win in a general election. And who are the alternatives? So in a sense, that is how I would sum up American politics. Both parties held hostage to entirely different phenomena, but phenomena that are inescapable.
But what would it say about the Republican Party or even America if Donald Trump, a man who could be, come this time next year, be facing charges in all those investigations, is still the nominee and is still a man who then could go on and win? What does that say about, the American rule of law? You were having a conversation earlier in the week about, the fact that Richard Nixon was never charged over Watergate, that he was pardoned, was a stain on American democracy. What would that say about America if Donald Trump were to make it back into the White House?
Well, it's extraordinary, isn't it? I mean, at the moment, lawyers are saying to us, this is a great teachable moment. It shows you, even if these charges don't stick at the end, it shows you that no man, even a billionaire ex-president, is above the law. But if he manages to circumvent the law, if he manages to get off, especially on some of these other charges that might be coming down the line, and he wins the presidency from, either from, a courtroom or indeed a jail cell, which he can do by the Constitution. Constitutionally, that is entirely possible. This would be extraordinary. And it would basically show to the rest of the world that America is, just another banana republic, albeit a supersized one. You've got to occasionally have to stand back from the weeds and look at the wider picture. The fact that he could question the election result as he did, try to overturn it as he did, and then incite, or rather prevent from storming, the citadel of democracy, Capitol Hill, on the January the 6th, took him a long time to tell these people to stop, right? All these things should render him completely unacceptable to the vast majority of voters in this country, but they haven't. Your ability to buy into the lie of January the 6th was a litmus test for, more than half the Republican congressmen who were affected by those events on that day. It became the litmus test for people getting his endorsement in the midterm elections. It was a lie that Fox News, his biggest trumpet, bought into, even though we know this from court proceedings, even though they knew it was a bunch of BS. They still went along with it. And this is where I get back to my original point. Because this is a society which is based on celebrity, which is based on theatre, and because American politics lends itself so beautifully to all that, we, and I think including us, have bought into this idea that Trump he may be bad for planet Earth, but he's damn good for ratings, right? That's what the head of CBS, Les Moonves, said in the 2016 election. And I'm afraid to say we're all slightly guilty of that. And of course it becomes slightly different if he is actually charged with crimes of sedition overturning democracy, then it's a very, very serious matter that deserves all the attention that it should be getting.
Given everything we've spoken about and where you started this conversation was about the attention we've given Donald Trump, the lesson we learned or we didn't learn from 2015, 2016 was that it's free airtime for him, that he is Teflon Trump. Nothing stops him from being diminished by his supporters. How do we proceed over the next year and a half with the investigations, with his nomination? How have we learned how to deal and to cover Donald Trump?
I think the answer has to be no. If it's exciting, if it's theatrical, and if we can make a case for it mattering, this is not just celebrity news, it is political news, then we have to cover it. And so in a sense, we're caught between a rock and a hard place. We're caught between the ratings and the principles. You can't ignore Donald Trump because he was, after all, elected in 2016 in the Electoral College, and no presidential candidate has ever received more individual votes than anyone else, than Donald Trump, apart from one guy, and he's called Joe Biden.
Matt Frei, our presenter in New York, thank you for talking to me today. Thank you.
It's a pleasure.